vielleicht mal etwas von einem Unternehmen, das nicht so gut funktioniert hat, scheinbar. Es geht um ein Unternehmen, das ihr kennt. Ich habe ja gesagt, heute geht es ein bisschen auch um Wirtschaft, um Business. Es geht jetzt um The Death of Europe's Last Electronics Giant. Wer könnte das sein? Erstaunlicherweise ist das eine Firma, von der ich sehr viele Geräte hier zu Hause rumstehen habe. Unter anderem, zack, und wieder aus. Genau. Es geht um Philips.
In 2010, the CEO of Philips proudly announced to the media that, quote, "We are no longer a high-tech company." Not a sentence that you'd expect to hear voluntarily from a company that just a decade earlier was every bit as much of a giant and an innovator as Samsung or Sony. And
Na, zumindest machen sie Lampen, die bunt leuchten, ne? Wobei, die machen sie ja noch nicht mal selber, die kommen ja quasi von so einer Side-Geschichte, ne?
Until recently was the third largest electronics company in the whole world with over 350,000 employees at its peak. But this statement was true and intentional. The company that once dominated whole industries from lighting to radio, the company that invented or co-invented almost every major physical media format from the compact cassette to the CD, the DVD and the Blu-ray. And
wirklich? Was? Das wusste ich gar nicht, dass die da so tief in der Entwicklung mit drin waren. Ist das traurig.
The company that arguably birthed much of the semiconductor industry, including giants like ASML and Taiwan's TSMC as well, well, that company has indeed become an insignificant shell of its former self by the 2010s. From the outside, Philips still seems like kind of an electronics giant. Just in my life, I have Philips Hue lights all over our studio, a Philips vacuum cleaner at home, a Philips electric razor for trimming my beard, and a Philips Ambilight TV in my parents' place, while elsewhere, Philips branded monitors, DVD players, loudspeakers, radios, coffee machines and more are still pretty common too. But this strength...
Habt ihr was von Philips? Jetzt mal ganz kurz so reingefragt. Also wie gesagt, mein ganzer Streamraum, mein ganzes Büro, meine ganze Wohnung ist komplett voll mit solchen Lampen, ne? Das ist tatsächlich so.
Is mostly an illusion. The company makes almost none of the products that it's known for today. And I don't just mean...
Oha, genau. Das ist nämlich das Ding. Das mit den Lampen, das ist ja gar nicht Philips eigentlich.
That they're outsourcing their manufacturing. From lighting to TV to domestic appliances, the company has given up on the whole electronics industry and has sold its business piece by piece to competitors, mostly in Asia, and then they just sold those companies the rights to keep using their brand too. The only two consumer-facing product lines that Philips still has today are razors and oral hygiene products.
Was?
Like electric toothbrushes, which together make up only about 15% of its business, which in total is now less than a tenth of the size of a current electronics giant like Samsung. It is fitting then that Philips dropped electronics from its name officially in 2013, and together with their other blunders like their complete failure in the semiconductor industry as well, the statement of this no longer being a high-tech company seems oddly accurate. So this is the sad story of how decades of mismanagement and failed innovation made Europe's last electronics giant kind of irrelevant. This video was sponsored by my streaming service Nebula and my very own podcast that I've been family, and over these 130 years, the company has developed 5 very significant business units, each with a lasting legacy. As its logo indicates, the first business unit, which the company got its start with, was lighting, where they made things such as light bulbs. Philips slowly built...
Ah, da kam die tatsächlich sogar her, ne? Dann macht das natürlich Sinn hier mit den Hü-Geschichten.
Its way to the top of this market by combining solid product quality with great marketing and aggressive business practices as well. In 1925, for example, Philips became part of the now...
Ah, sehr spannendes Thema. Sehr spannendes Thema. Habe ich schon mal eine Geschichtspodcast-Folge drüber gehört, über das Phoebus-Kartell.
Infamous Phoebus cartel, together with competitors like General Electric and Germany's Osram and a few others, where the various companies agreed to come together and artificially increase prices while also lowering useful lifespans of light bulbs to a maximum of 1,000 hours.
Herzlich willkommen im Kapitalismus.
These companies basically invented planned obsolescence, and while the cartel was dissolved around the Second World War, Philips continued to grow steadily and became the largest producer of lighting products worldwide. The business remained relatively solid until the 2000s, when LED technologies fundamentally upset the economics of the industry, and Philips decided that they'd be better off just separating their whole lighting division into an independent company than they would be by figuring out how to bring it back to profitability. This is a practice that you'll see quite often from the company, and so in 2016, Signify was born as a new and independent company that carried on Philips's lighting business. And since its independence, it has significantly outperformed its parent Philips that so desperately wanted to offload it due to finding new major success in connected lights and the Internet of Things. Either way, Philips in the early days used the originally profitable business of light bulbs in 1914 to finance their so-called Philips Physics Laboratory, an extremely ambitious, dedicated research organization that acted much like the legendary Xerox PARC or AT&T's Bell Laboratories. With generous funding and thousands of the world's best scientists, including even occasionally a visiting Albert Einstein, they developed many fundamental scientific breakthroughs, including the cornerstones of modern radio technology. This research formed
Das ist ja unglaublich, ey.
Philips's second successful product category, which also happens to be visible in the company's logo. These waves likely symbolize radio waves or sound waves, and once they invented and patented things like new transmitters, which could carry radio waves around the entire globe, Philips launched its own radio station in 1927, connecting the Netherlands to its colonies across the world, and
Schaut, mein König, wir haben eine neue technologische Entwicklung. Wir können nun mit unseren Sklaven und Kolonialherren überall auf der Welt kommunizieren. Gut gemacht, ich schlage dich zum Ritter.
The company also became
Ist das... Ach, das ist, wenn, es ist so aus der Zeit gefallen einfach.
the largest supplier of radios in the whole world just 3 years later. Then, off the strength of their radio business, they expanded even further into adjacent categories, creating, for example, the compact cassette, the first ultra-successful physical media format for music and speech, and especially good fit for their radio business. And Philips struck gold with this. Not only did they get to make cassette players and cassettes themselves, but also if anybody else made either, they got a license payment, and they kickstarted the whole modern mass music industry. So that was a huge deal. But after this initial success, cracks started appearing in the company's innovation. They practically invented the CD as well, but were hesitant to commercialize it as they knew that that would cannibalize their existing cassette.
Oh nein, oh nein, oh nein, oh nein. Oh, so oft gehört solche Geschichten. Hey, wir haben die nächste krasse Technologie, aber aua, nee, oh nee, das ist nicht gut für uns. Nee, lass mal bei dem alten Scheiß bleiben, der läuft.
Business, and so in their hesitation, Sony caught up with them, and then Philips ended up having to share the format with the Japanese giant. And while that was still a huge success, their role in the next format, the DVD, was even smaller, while for the Blu-ray, they took a clear backseat behind Sony, despite contributing many of its innovations themselves. So Philips gradually fell behind, in part because they were too slow to keep up with the competition, but in part also because they bet on the wrong technologies multiple times. Like Video 2000, an unsuccessful competitor from Philips to the VHS, or CDI, an interactive CD format that the company bet $1 billion on just to lose it all. And even worse, the company was completely unable to adapt to media consumption trends past the physical media formats, like iPods, smartphones, music streaming, or even just Bluetooth headphones. Philips was basically completely unable to keep up with this industry over time. Still, the company...
Ja, ich glaube, da war einfach auch dann die Geschwindigkeit des Wachstums der Konkurrenz einfach viel zu groß.
His third major business unit, consumer electronics, arguably evolved from the success of their audiovisual business. Following the example of their Japanese competitors, they adopted the conglomerate model, where a company builds a huge portfolio of products instead of focusing on any one particular thing. But for Philips, this massive expansion did not go well in the end. In some product categories, like shavers, where they had unique inventions, such as their patented circular rotating blade system, they could create defensible and profitable product lines. But in most, Philips was just one of hundreds of brands competing over scraps. Now, to be clear.
Ja, und da muss man halt die Frage stellen, warum kauft man dann das, wenn die Marke an sich halt auch für nichts im Speziellen steht. Und das ist ja was Apple dann einfach so grandios gemacht hat. Man ist bereit, viel Geld dafür auszugeben, weil man dieses Gefühl von etwas Besonderem bekommen hat. Und bei Philips, wenn überall auf jedem Produkt Philips draufstehen kann, ist es ja auch nichts Besonderes.
Their lack of success did not come from a lack of trying. They made big bets, they took huge risks, and they kept trying to innovate, just usually into the wrong direction. For example, they developed their own computer line, but their machines often weren't compatible with industry standard software, so few people ended up buying them. Or they leaned heavily into web TVs, the idea that people would surf the internet and email from their TVs through a simplified user interface rather than from their full PC, which again flopped.
Gut, das war eine Wette. Ja, also das kann man beim besten Willen nicht wissen, in welchem Bereich was sich da durchsetzt. Und ich hätte mir das durchaus vorstellen können, so als Übergang zu Smartphones liegt das ja nahe eigentlich.
And they even had a fairly innovative cell phone lineup, including this prototype that basically turned a regular cell phone into a quasi-touchscreen smartphone with one of the first ever 2G connections.
Krass, einfach zu früh. Das ist ja auch nicht uninnovativ, das war einfach zu früh.
Ever. Pretty wild, but again, nobody really bought their phones. These were costly mistakes, and they paint a picture of a company that liked solving hard technical problems, but completely lost touch with the realities of consumer expectations. Meanwhile, the relentless competition, primarily from Asia, drove the margins of just about every commodity electronics product close to zero as well. Philips made a ton of stuff, including lots of innovative stuff, but by the late 80s, increasingly, none of it made any money for the company. Of the $137 billion in revenue that they made from electronics in this period, they only managed to keep 3.7. That is a margin of only 2.7% over a decade, a ratio that would be pitifully low even for contract manufacturers like Foxconn, let alone for the likes of Sony and Samsung, who typically have margins around 10 or maybe 20%.
Das ist ja wirklich krass, Alter. Und das ging alles in Forschung. Das hätte eher an Marktforschung gehen sollen und weniger in die Entwicklung von Innovationen, die am Ende ihrer Zeit voraus waren oder einfach am Konsumenten vorbei. Aber fantastisch, also spannend einfach, mal diesen Downfall irgendwie zu beobachten, weil es eben nicht eine große Katastrophe war, sondern man im Endeffekt einfach eine Strategie gefahren ist, die über lange Zeit einfach schiefgegangen ist.
After multiple painful defeats, Philips essentially decided to completely give up on electronics and on risky innovations as well. This is where the quote from the beginning of the video comes from, and also the time period when Philips decided to offload all of their electronics businesses too. In 2001, they disbanded their famous research lab. In 2012, they sold their TV and monitor business to a Hong Kong-based company called TP Vision. A year later,
ach, das ist gar nicht mehr Philips.
Later, they sold their audiovisual business to a Japanese company called Funai. And finally, in 2021, Philips sold its last major electronics business unit in the form of its domestic appliances division that made things like vacuum cleaners and coffee machines too.
Also da ist halt auch nicht mehr Philips drin. Interessant.
Officially exited the electronics industry. And now, while that is sad, an even more disappointing story comes from the company's fourth massive business unit, semiconductors. The public probably doesn't remember Philips as a semiconductor company these days, but they absolutely were a massive pioneer in this field. They started in 1953 primarily by developing components for their own electronic devices, and then they quietly grew, including with major acquisitions, until they became the second largest semiconductor company in the whole world. But while they had success at first, they started suffering similar problems with semiconductors as they did with electronics around the 80s and 90s, such as making a big and failed bet on a new technology called SRAM memory, which cost the company $1 billion again, as well as generally poor management in a very difficult and fluctuating market. So Philips's whole semiconductor business was sold off and became an independent company in 2006, which is now known as NXP. NXP mostly focuses on designing and manufacturing specialized chips for cars and industrial applications, and free of their parents' company's poor decision-making, NXP became a much more successful company that actually managed to overtake its former parent. As of today, NXP is worth about 4 times as much as Philips, and it is much...
Ja, manchmal kann es einfach auch helfen, aus diesen Strukturen auszubrechen und dem ein neues Umfeld zu geben, wie man hier sieht, weil offensichtlich ja viele von diesen Bereichen Potenzial hatten, nur nicht im Umfeld der Mutter, des Mutterkonzerns.
More profitable as well. Ouch. But even more mind-boggling than NXP is that Philips essentially kickstarted both of the world's two most important semiconductor companies today, TSMC and ASML. ASML, the only company in the world that can make the most important machines for chip production, is today worth $266 billion, or about 15 times as much as Philips, and it is Europe's most valuable technology company by far. And it was Philips who started it, together with another firm called ASM in 1984. Their focus on lithography.
Ja, was heißt jetzt started? Wem gehört das jetzt? Wer steckt da jetzt dahinter? Hä? Haben die das dann auch verkauft quasi? Oder wie? Oder was? Das verstehe ich jetzt nicht ganz.
The process of using light to transfer chip designs onto silicon wafers meant that Philips, the largest lighting company in the world with a sizable semiconductor business, was very well positioned to compete in this field. But as development took longer than expected and the market was kind of rough in those years, both of the founding companies decided to largely give up on the venture and
oh nein, oh Gott.
They sold it off to become an independent entity.
Oh Gott, oh Gott, oh Gott, das ist ja wirklich ein Horrorfilm hier, das ist ja unfassbar. Meine Güte. Meine Güte. Kann da bitte jemand einen Hollywood-Film draus machen und zu Halloween veröffentlichen?
4 years of operations. And this was done as part of the 5th major restructuring that Philips went through in those 2 decades. What a chaotic business. And as for TSMC, I've already made a whole dedicated video about them, which you should watch if you haven't seen it yet. But long story short, the Taiwanese giant is currently the world's 2nd most valuable chip company and is absolutely dominating the manufacturing side of the industry. The company had a rough start early on, struggling to find investors initially, and Philips was the only
Nightmare on Philips Street, genau.
Private company willing to take a chance on them. In 1986, the Dutch company helped TSMC get off the ground with money, key technologies, and of course access to ASML as well, and in exchange it got a 27.5% share in the new venture. Given TSMC's current valuation, that stake alone would be worth $121 billion today, or about 7 times as much as all of what remains of Philips combined. But just like with ASML and NXP,
ist das schrecklich.
The Dutch giant exited its position and sold its shares early. In other words, Philips partially birthed the modern semiconductor industry, and they managed to incubate 3 of the world's most important chip companies.
Ist das unglaublich? Ist das unglaublich?
And yet they captured very little of the value that they created. How incredibly frustrating. And
dieses Video hat mein Leben auf jeden Fall nicht besser gemacht. Ich bin jetzt auch frustriert, obwohl ich mit der Firma nichts zu tun habe. Kein Aktionär bin, nichts, absolut gar nichts. Aber irgendwie finde ich das super traurig.
Fifth and final big industry was healthcare tech. They got serious about this sector relatively late, especially in the 2000s, and the company found success primarily in imaging, MRI machines, CT machines, etc. Philips found that with an aging population, this industry was seeing a steady growth, with safety and reliability being a concern. Price competition wasn't nearly as aggressive. With heavy regulatory protections, there isn't as much competition, and this industry is also less cyclical than semiconductors or consumer electronics too. This is a significantly smaller business than all of the other stuff that they were doing in the past, but it's a much more comfortable one, especially for a European brand with a long heritage and good government relations. So Philips decided to focus on this completely. Today, Philips sees itself primarily and completely as a health tech company. On the one hand, this
soll es sich gut fühlen. Stand jetzt scheinst du für deine Existenz bessere Entscheidungen zu treffen als Philips für seine. Das könnt ihr ja gar nicht einschätzen. Außerdem kann man das auch erst in the long run einschätzen, nicht wahr?
This is kind of a good thing. It gives them a clear focus at least, which might end up being a real benefit. But on the other, their actual performance here has been mediocre too, including having a massive recall just recently. And even in this field, their comfortable position might not be safe forever. The company itself notes that new trends like telemedicine or AI-powered diagnosis and more all threaten to bring a fundamental shakeup of this industry eventually too. And while Philips now at least once again invests a fairly ambitious 9 to 10% of its revenue into R&D, it is far from certain that that will be enough so that they don't oversleep whatever the next revolution in healthcare is, just like they have overslept similar changes in the music, semiconductor, or electronics industries in the past too. So Philips had it all and lost it all. This is a company that brought incredible innovations to the market and then fell on its face again and again. It failed to build success.
Unfassbar, wie spannend, aber natürlich auch frustrierend diese Geschichte ist. Und über so, also wer denkt denn über so eine Firma nach? Ohne Witz.
Successful defensible electronics products like Apple's iPhone or Sony's PlayStation, leaving them to fight over scraps in an increasingly ruthless market. It failed to build a successful chip business, unlike its competitors like Samsung and Sony, and it failed to adapt to changing consumer preferences like those in the music industry again and again, too. Quite a tragic collapse. So that's sad, but I actually also have some good news. Next, I'd like to talk about my brand new podcast called The Friday Chiller.
Apropos, weil wir gerade von schlechten Business-Ideen gesprochen haben, lasst uns über gute Business-Ideen sprechen. Okay, alles klar. Das war's dann für das Video. Aber das war super spannend und ich hab jetzt auch schon ein paar Mal drüber nachgedacht, ob ich vielleicht auch mal sowas machen sollte, ne? Vielleicht mal neben dem ganzen Exposen und Erklären von irgendwelchen politischen Entwicklungen, vielleicht auch mal den Blick zurück riskieren, wie Sachen einfach zu den Sachen geworden sind, die sie jetzt sind, ne? Also das fand ich beispielsweise mega spannend gerade, super interessant, habe ich mich niemals mit auseinandergesetzt und wäre ich auf keinen Fall drauf gekommen. Beispielsweise, ich sehe das gerade so, ne? Was ist zum Beispiel die Firma Röde, wie auch immer, wie spricht man das aus? Wäre schon mal interessant, ne? Oder was steckt eigentlich wirklich im Mio-Mate? Ich glaube, das gehört zu Coca-Cola oder sowas. Wäre auch super spannend. Ja, muss ich mal drüber nachdenken. Was würdet ihr davon halten? Man kann ja auch nicht immer nur wütend sein, ne? Man kann ja auch mal traurig sein in einem Video, ne? Oder sowas. Die Zerstörung von Nokia, das ist doch unmöglich. Nee, die haben sie ja selber. Naja, egal. Wobei das natürlich, Nokia, wisst ihr, das wäre auch nochmal, das ist ja eine noch katastrophalere Geschichte eigentlich. Vielleicht mache ich das mal, so als Entspannung zwischendurch.